My stepchildren told me I wasn't their real family, that only their biological parents had a say. They said it standing in the middle of my own living room, with that smirk only teenagers can master, daring me to argue. I didn't. I let their words hang in the air like smoke, bitter and lingering. I stayed quiet. But silence is not weakness. Sometimes, silence is the sharpest blade in the room. My name is Benjamin Cole, 42 years old. For most of my life, I thought I understood discipline, patience, and sacrifice. I built a stable career, a modest home, and after years of loneliness, I found Laura. She had 2 children from her first marriage, Ethan, 17, and Chloe, 15. I stepped into their world not as an intruder, but as a man determined to build something whole again. I thought effort and consistency would win them over. I was wrong. For years, I poured myself into this house, into our house. I paid the bills, kept the lights on, repaired the leaks, shoveled the snow from the driveway at dawn while they slept in warm beds. And yet, to them, I was invisible. Worse than invisible, I was disposable, a placeholder they tolerated until their real father, Mark, showed up with his charming smile and broken promises. That afternoon, when they mocked me under my own roof, it wasn't the first time they'd tried to cut me down, but something in me shifted. Maybe it was the way Ethan leaned back, crossing his arms, like a king on a borrowed throne, or the way Chloe's laughter dripped with contempt, sharp enough to slice the air. They weren't just rebelling. They were testing the foundation of everything I'd built here, and for the first time, I realized I was letting them. Laura tried to soften the edges when she came home that evening. She wrapped her arms around me in the kitchen, whispered that they were just kids. But kids grow into adults who carry their lessons with them. What were Ethan and Chloe learning now? That they could spit in the face of responsibility and the man who carried it, and there'd be no consequence? That words were cheap and respect optional? I sat at the dinner table that night. Sophie, my little girl, swinging her legs beside me, her plate half filled with mashed potatoes. She doesn't share their blood, but she shares my name, my heartbeat, my silence. She reached for my hand under the table, small fingers gripping mine, and in that instant, the decision hardened inside me like cement. I didn't argue with Ethan or Chloe. I didn't defend myself to Laura. I didn't shout or slam doors. Instead, I watched. I listened. I let them believe they had won something by declaring me irrelevant. But the truth was simpler. Authority doesn't live in words. It lives in action. And I had more power in this house than anyone wanted to admit. Every privilege they enjoyed, every subscription, every ride, every unlocked door, every meal on the table was tied to my name. And that night, I decided they would feel the weight of my silence. I looked across the table at Ethan. He was laughing at something on his phone, shoulders loose, completely unbothered. Chloe tossed her hair, scrolling on the tablet I had bought last Christmas. They didn't even notice my eyes on them. They thought the storm had passed. But storms don't announce themselves. They gather quietly until the sky splits open. And in that moment, under the soft glow of the dining room light, I knew by tomorrow, nothing in this house would look the same.
The next morning, the house looked ordinary from the outside, but inside I could feel the fracture lines like cracks spreading across old plaster. 2 worlds under one roof pulling against each other. On one side was Sophie, 6 years old, who woke up early and padded into the kitchen in her pajamas, hair sticking up in soft curls. She climbed into my lap while I sipped my coffee, laid her head on my chest, and mumbled, "Morning, Daddy." Her trust was effortless, her love without calculation. She didn't question who I was. She didn't weigh me against another man. To her, I was home. And then there were Ethan and Chloe. They came downstairs hours later, earbuds in, eyes glued to glowing screens, not even glancing in my direction. Ethan opened the fridge, rummaged, and muttered, "There's nothing here." He pulled out a soda, one I had bought, and walked away without closing the door. Chloe complained about Wi-Fi speed, rolling her eyes when I suggested she restart the router. To them, I wasn't a father, not even a figure. I was a service. Laura tried to bridge the gap. She'd say things like, "They just need time," or "They're still adjusting." But time had already passed, years of it. Adjusting wasn't the problem. They weren't adjusting because they didn't want to. And every time she excused their disrespect, the divide widened. That morning, I watched Sophie draw at the table with crayons while her half-siblings barked orders into their phones, making weekend plans I hadn't been consulted about. Plans that assumed my car, my money, my time. And I felt it again, the cold certainty from the night before. This wasn't a family. It was a house divided, and divided houses don't stand forever. Later that day, I found Ethan sprawled across the couch, sneakers on the armrest, scrolling. His backpack lay open on the floor, books spilling out like a silent protest. I asked him to pick it up, calm even. He didn't look up. He just said, "You can't tell me what to do. You're not my dad." The words weren't new, but this time they carried weight, because they mirrored the declaration from last night. Chloe smirked, backing him up with a sharp little laugh. "Yeah, we don't have to listen to you. Only mom and dad matter." I felt Sophie's eyes on me from across the room. She was clutching her stuffed rabbit, watching. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She saw the divide. And that was when it hit me. If I stayed silent forever, if I allowed this mockery to continue unchecked, Sophie would grow up thinking this was normal, that disrespect was acceptable, that a man who carried the load of a house could be treated like a ghost within it. I couldn't allow that. Laura came in a few minutes later, grocery bags in hand, and froze at the tension in the air. She set the bags down, glanced at me, then at the kids. "What's going on?" she asked. Ethan shrugged, Chloe smirked again, and I just smiled faintly, shook my head and said, "Nothing worth arguing about." Because it wasn't. Not anymore. That evening, as the house settled into its usual rhythm, TV murmuring, footsteps overhead, Sophie asleep in her bed, I sat in the dark living room staring at the door. I imagined it locked, new keys in my pocket. I imagined their shocked faces when the privileges they took for granted vanished one by one. I could already see the storm gathering. And what they didn't know? What Laura didn't even suspect was that I had already decided how far it would go.
Mark always managed to appear at the right time, at least the right time for him. When bills were paid, when the fridge was full, when the kids needed new shoes or the Wi-Fi was humming along, he'd sweep in with that easy grin and a joke ready for Ethan and Chloe. To them, he was the fun parent, the one who never said no, the one who promised the world without paying the price for it. I used to wonder if he noticed the way their eyes lit up when he walked in, or the way they dimmed when I spoke. But then I realized it wasn't an accident. He cultivated it. He wanted them to see me as the outsider, the stiff shadow lurking in their perfect picture of a family that no longer existed. One Friday evening, Mark came to pick them up for the weekend. I was in the driveway, taking the trash out, when he pulled up in his dented pickup, engine coughing like an old smoker. He climbed out, sunglasses still on, even though the sun had already dropped. "Hey, champ," he called to Ethan, ignoring me completely. Chloe rushed past me with her bag as though I were a lamppost blocking her path. He finally glanced my way, gave me a nod that carried no weight, and said, "Appreciate you looking out for them." His tone made it sound less like gratitude and more like dismissal, as though I were the babysitter he could afford to forget about. I wanted to answer. I wanted to say, "Looking out for them? I'm the one keeping this roof over their heads, Mark. I'm the one making sure they eat, study, have a future." But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I watched. I watched as he leaned on the truck, spinning stories about the trip they'd take someday, about the gifts he'd buy when money wasn't so tight. His words poured out like smoke from an untended fire. Plenty of heat, no substance. And the kids ate it up, hanging on to every word. Laura tried to defend him once, said he was doing his best. But his best never seemed to stretch beyond words. When Ethan's cleats needed replacing, it was my credit card. When Chloe wanted a new tablet, it was my signature on the receipt. When Sophie needed braces in a few years, I knew whose wallet it would come from. And yet every time Mark arrived, the balance of power shifted. He didn't just bring his pickup and his empty promises. He brought the reminder that in their eyes, he was the real father. And I was the intruder. But here's the truth no one seemed willing to face. Mark wasn't a ghost because he was absent. He was a ghost because he was hollow, a shell of responsibility with nothing inside. And sooner or later, the kids would see it. That weekend, when they came back from his place, Ethan dropped his bag by the door and muttered, "Dad says you don't get to make the rules." Chloe chimed in, "Yeah, only Mom and Dad can tell us what to do." Their voices were smug, armed with borrowed ammunition. I stood there listening and smiled faintly. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. But because I realized something they hadn't yet. Mark's words had given me the very leverage I needed. If he wanted to claim authority, he could have it. He could have every ounce of it. And with it the responsibility he had been dodging for years. They didn't know it then, but the next time Mark's name came out of their mouths as a weapon, it wouldn't cut me down. It would cut them off.
It started with the keys. I drove to the hardware store one evening, nothing unusual about it. Picked up a set of new locks, paid in cash, and drove home with the bag on the passenger seat. No announcement, no speech, just quiet preparation. The house looked the same from the outside when I pulled in, but inside, something was already different. That night, while everyone slept, I moved like a shadow. The front door, the back door, even the garage, each one got a new lock. The clicks of the screws tightening were steady, deliberate. By the time I finished, I held the old locks in my hands, heavy and cold, useless now. I slipped into bed beside Laura just before dawn. She stirred, murmured something soft, then fell back asleep. She didn't notice the weight of change lying in the nightstand drawer. The next morning, Ethan came downstairs, jingling his keys like he always did. He headed out to meet a friend, shoved his key into the lock, and it didn't turn. He frowned, tried again, harder this time. Then he shouted, "Mom, something's wrong with the door." Laura looked at me, confusion in her eyes. I'd just sipped my coffee. Chloe tried next, holding up her pink glitter key with a dramatic sigh. It slid in, twisted halfway, then stuck. "Seriously? Did you break this?" she snapped at me. I didn't answer. I only said, "I guess some doors don't open for everyone." That was only the beginning. By the end of the week, the Wi-Fi password had changed. Netflix, gone. Uber rides they ordered through my account, canceled. The gym membership they flaunted to friends, terminated. Credit cards they'd borrowed for emergencies, suddenly declined. Every invisible string that tied their comfort to me, cut. At first, they thought it was a glitch. "The Wi-Fi's down," Chloe screamed from her room. "Call the company." Ethan stormed into the kitchen, waving his useless card. "This thing got declined. Fix it." But when they looked at me, expecting the fixer, the provider, the invisible hand behind their comfort, they saw nothing but calm. I folded the newspaper, set it aside, and said, "Not my problem." Laura tried to intervene. "Benjamin, this is too much. They're just kids." But even her voice lacked conviction now. Because deep down she knew, kids or not, Ethan and Chloe weren't learning respect. They were learning entitlement, and I had just rewritten the lesson plan. One evening, Chloe stomped into the living room, face red. "This isn't fair. Dad says you can't do this." Ethan stood behind her, nodding, puffing up like her bodyguard. I leaned back in my chair, studying them. "Then maybe you should ask your dad to turn the Wi-Fi back on, or pay for your Uber, or get you into the gym. See how far you get." Their silence was louder than their shouting had ever been. For the first time, I watched realization flicker across Ethan's face. Not much, not enough to admit defeat, but just enough to understand. The authority they'd mocked was the same authority holding their world together. And when Sophie tugged at my sleeve that night, asking why Ethan and Chloe were so mad, I knelt to her level and whispered, "Because sometimes people forget what it takes to make a home. And sometimes you have to remind them." The old locks sat in a box in the garage, cold and useless, like relics from another time. But the house itself felt lighter, steadier, as if the weight of years of disrespect had finally begun to shift. And deep down, I knew we'd only just begun.
Laura noticed before anyone else. She noticed the missing subscriptions, the canceled cards, the subtle new locks that clicked differently when she turned her key. She wasn't blind, she just wanted to believe it would pass. One evening, after Sophie was tucked in and the older kids had slammed their doors upstairs, she found me in the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound between us. She stood there with her arms crossed, her face somewhere between frustration and fear. "Benjamin," she said, her voice low, "what are you doing?" I set down my coffee, leaned back in the chair. "I'm teaching." "Teaching," she snapped. "You're punishing. You've taken away everything. The Wi-Fi, the cards, the memberships. God, even the locks on the doors." I met her eyes and let the silence stretch until she shifted under it. "Everything," I said slowly, "that had my name on it, that I worked for, that they mocked while they used it. Yes, I took it back." Her lips parted, ready with the retort, but no words came. She pressed her hands against the counter instead. "They're kids, Ben. They don't understand." I shook my head. "Laura, they understand perfectly. They understand enough to say to my face that I'm not family, that only you and Mark matter. They understand enough to humiliate me in the house I pay for. They understand." She blinked hard, swallowing. For the first time, I saw the hesitation, the doubt. "You're going to lose them if you keep this up," she whispered. I already lost them. Or maybe I never had them to begin with. What I won't lose is my place in this home. Not for their rebellion, not for your excuses. Her eyes burned at that, but I didn't flinch. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. My voice dropped steady and cold. "I don't ask for gratitude, Laura. I don't even ask for love. But I will not be disrespected in my own house. If they want to test me, let them. If Mark wants to play the hero, let him. But this ends now, tonight, because the next time they throw those words at me, they won't just lose privileges, they'll lose the roof over their heads." The weight of the words filled the kitchen like smoke. She didn't argue. She just stared at me, searching for something in my face, maybe weakness, maybe regret. She found neither. Upstairs, Chloe's laughter carried through the vents, muffled but sharp.
Ethan's voice followed, louder, bragging about weekend plans. They had no idea the walls around them had already shifted. No idea that their world was being rewritten without their permission. Laura finally sank into the chair across from me, her hands trembling slightly. "You sound like you don't care if this breaks us." I looked at her for a long time before answering. "I care, Laura, but caring doesn't mean letting myself be destroyed. If you stand with them in this, then yes, it might break us. But if you see what's happening, if you see what they're becoming, then maybe it saves us." She had no reply. The silence between us was thick, unbroken, until the old grandfather clock in the hall chimed once, twice, 3 times. I rose, kissed her on the forehead, and said, "Decide where you stand, because tomorrow things won't look the same." And as I walked away, leaving her alone in the dim kitchen, I knew the battle line had been drawn, not just with the children, but with the woman I had chosen to build this life with.
Children see more than we think. They don't always understand the politics of adults, the venom hidden in words, but they feel it. They sense the fracture lines. Sophie was no different. One evening, after dinner, Ethan and Chloe were in the living room arguing with Laura. Their voices rose, sharp, accusing. "Mom, he can't do this. Dad says he has no right," Chloe shouted. Ethan chimed in, his fist hitting the arm of the couch. "We're not listening to him, ever. He's not our father." I stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed, letting their words ricochet through the walls. Laura's face was pale, torn between defending me and keeping peace. And in the middle of it all, from the hallway, Sophie appeared. Small, barefoot, clutching her stuffed rabbit against her chest. She didn't understand their words, not completely, but she understood the way they pointed at me. She understood the way their laughter cut. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, found mine. I knelt to meet her, blocking the storm behind me. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered. But she shook her head. "They're mean to you, Daddy." Her voice was tiny, but it pierced the room like glass breaking. Silence followed, heavy, awkward. Ethan shifted in his seat. Chloe looked away. Laura pressed her hand to her mouth. Sophie didn't stop. "You're my real dad," she said simply. "'Cause you're the one who's here. You're the one who takes care of me." For a second, no one breathed. The weight of her innocence was unbearable. Ethan scoffed, muttered something under his breath, but even he couldn't hold her gaze. Chloe's bravado faltered, and Laura's eyes filled with tears. I picked Sophie up, her small arms wrapping around my neck, and I carried her upstairs without another word. Behind me, the silence was louder than all the shouting had been. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat by her bed and watched her chest rise and fall in the soft rhythm of dreams. I thought about what her words meant, not just to me, but to her future. Children learn from what they see. If I allowed myself to be mocked, diminished, erased, she would learn that love without respect was enough. That a man could carry the weight of a home and still be invisible. No, that lesson would not be hers. I walked back downstairs. The house was dim, the only light coming from the television, muted and flickering. Ethan and Chloe had vanished to their rooms. Laura sat on the couch, staring at the blank wall, her hands clasped tight. "She's just a child," Laura whispered when she noticed me. "Yes," I said, "and even she sees what's happening here." Laura closed her eyes, as if wishing away the truth. "They're hurting, Benjamin. You can't just—" "They're not the only ones hurting," I cut in. My voice was low, steady. "And Sophie's watching. Every word, every action, she's learning what family means.
Do you want her to grow up believing love is optional and respect negotiable? Because I don't." Laura said nothing. The silence between us stretched again, thick and suffocating. Upstairs, Sophie shifted in her sleep, the floor creaking softly. And in that fragile sound, I heard both a warning and a promise. The storm in this house wasn't just mine to face anymore. It belonged to Sophie, too. And I would not let her grow up under a roof where the truth of fatherhood was mocked out of existence. I had drawn the line for myself. Now, I would draw it for her.
I made the call on a Sunday evening. The house was thick with tension. Ethan sulking in his room, Chloe blasting music as if volume could drown reality, Laura moving through the kitchen like a ghost. Sophie sat at the table, coloring quietly, her crayons scratching across paper. I picked up the phone, dialed the number I had avoided for weeks. When Mark answered, his voice was smug, casual, as though he'd been expecting this. "Benjamin," he said, drawing out my name like a joke. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "You can come pick up your kids," I said flatly. Silence on the other end, then a laugh. "Oh, really? Trouble in paradise." "You wanted to be the authority," I continued. "Ethan and Chloe made it clear they only answered to you. Fine. Tonight, they're yours." I hung up before he could reply. When his truck rumbled into the driveway an hour later, Ethan and Chloe came alive. Ethan grinned, bolting down the stairs 2 at a time. Chloe grabbed her bag, practically glowing. "Finally," she said under her breath. To them, Mark's arrival was a rescue. But when he stepped inside, leaning against the doorframe with that trademark grin, I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, quickly smothered by bravado. "Dad? He changed the locks. He cut off everything. You need to fix this." Chloe chimed in, pointing at me like a lawyer in court. "Yeah, he can't treat us like this. You're our real dad. You tell him." Mark looked at me, and for a moment his grin faltered. He wasn't expecting to be dragged into the courtroom his own children had built. Still, he puffed up his chest. "They're right, Benjamin. You've overstepped." I folded my arms. Overstepped? I pay for this house. I feed them, clothe them, cover every bill while you show up with promises you never keep. You want authority, Mark? Then carry the weight that comes with it. The kids froze, caught between the image of their father and the reality of his silence. Mark shifted, cleared his throat. "Well, my place isn't really set up right now. I mean, you know how it is. Work's been tight." "Work's always tight. Promises are always tomorrow, but tomorrow never comes, does it?" Ethan's shoulders slumped. Chloe hugged her bag tighter, confusion flashing across her face. The man they'd defended so fiercely, the man they'd used as a weapon against me, couldn't even offer them a bed for the night. Laura stood in the kitchen doorway, watching, her expression unreadable. She'd heard every word. Mark tried to recover, tried to flash that grin again. "Look, we'll work something out. Don't be so dramatic, Benjamin." But the damage was done. The illusion was gone. Ethan and Chloe saw it. The hollow hero they'd worshipped was nothing more than smoke and shadow. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "The locks have changed, Mark. The rules have changed. If you want to be their father, be their father. But don't expect me to keep paying for your title." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Chloe's eyes brimmed with something she'd never let me see before, doubt. And Mark, for the first time, looked small in his children's eyes. I turned away, my hand resting on Sophie's head as she peeked from behind me. "Good night," I said, and I closed the door on Mark, on his empty promises, and on the fragile illusion my stepchildren had clung to for too long.
The night after Mark's visit, the house was quieter than I'd ever heard it. No slammed doors, no loud music bleeding through the walls, no mocking laughter. Just silence. But this time, it wasn't my silence. It was theirs. Ethan avoided my eyes at breakfast. Chloe pushed her cereal around her bowl, the defiance gone from her posture. Laura watched the two of them, then glanced at me, as if searching for a signal of what to do next. I gave her none. Some lessons weren't taught with speeches. They were absorbed in the silence after the storm. I drove Sophie to school that morning. She hummed in the back seat, swinging her legs, completely unaware of the tectonic shift that had happened inside our walls. When I dropped her off, she kissed my cheek and said, "Bye, Daddy. Don't forget, you promised to read my story tonight." I smiled. Promises mean something when you keep them. When I returned, Laura was waiting at the kitchen table, her coffee untouched. She looked tired, older somehow. "You really meant it," she said. "I always mean what I say," I answered. Her eyes softened, then filled with something that looked like resignation. They see it now. They see who really holds this house together. Upstairs, I could hear Ethan pacing. Chloe was on the phone, voice hushed, not triumphant like before. The arrogance had drained from them, leaving behind something closer to recognition, maybe even respect, though they'd never admit it out loud. Not yet. By evening, Ethan came downstairs. He stood by the counter, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Can I borrow the car tomorrow?" His voice was low, cautious. I looked up at him, letting the pause stretch. Then I asked, "What's the first rule of borrowing something that isn't yours?" He hesitated. His jaw worked. Finally, the word came out. "Respect." I nodded once. "Then maybe we'll talk about it tomorrow." Chloe's turn came a few days later. She hovered in the doorway, tablet in hand, eyes downcast. "Can I get the Wi-Fi password?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. I closed the book I was reading. "The Wi-Fi isn't free, Chloe. It's not about money. It's about acknowledgement. Do you understand that?" Her cheeks flushed. She nodded quickly. "Yes." That was the beginning, not of their surrender, but of their understanding. The lines had been drawn, the old locks discarded, the privileges cut away. What remained was the truth they could no longer ignore. Respect wasn't optional, and authority wasn't a title you borrowed from biology. It was earned daily, by showing up, by staying, by carrying the weight no one else wanted. Laura and I sat together one night after Sophie had gone to bed, the older kids retreating to their rooms without complaint. She reached for my hand, her grip tight. "I was afraid you'd break us," she admitted. "But maybe this is what saves us." I didn't answer. Some truths don't need words. As I stood by the window, watching the quiet street outside, I thought about how much had changed in just a few weeks. The house still looked the same from the outside, but inside, it had been remade. Not by shouting, not by threats, but by silence that turned into law. I didn't need to prove I was family. I already was. The locks only reminded them of it.